Hey everyone, welcome back to the Gray Matter Health Podcast. So, oftentimes, my friends in my real life ask me, why do people seek out health coaching? And my answer to that has two parts, really. On the surface level, people are most likely looking for one of three things. They're either trying to lose weight, gain muscle, or perform better at some sort of athletic event. At least that's what most people walk in the door saying that they're looking for. But almost everyone who I get to know for over 6 months to a year ends up realizing that it's not really about those surface level goals. Almost everyone, I would say, who's looking to improve their health on a deeper level is really just looking for a stronger sense of self. That's kind of what I want to talk about today, because I think it's important to recognize that when we feel uncomfortable in our bodies for some reason or another, it's not just about the shape and size of our body. It's usually about our relationship to ourselves and how we feel like we're not living a life that's true to ourselves, or at least what we see doesn't feel authentic, doesn't feel realistic. I think this issue of authenticity is really what's at the core of a lot of our efforts for self improvement. And it's at the core of a lot of discomfort many of us have continuing to live life the way that we have. What I really want to do today is get to the bottom of that feeling of my life on paper looks great. I should be happy. Why am I not happy? And why do I feel kind of uncomfortable in myself and hollow inside? So, today I want to talk about this experience of loss of authenticity. This is an experience that happens naturally throughout most of our lives as we grow up and become adults. We relinquish parts of ourselves subconsciously, really, in order to conform to social expectations, conform to cultural expectations, get what we want out of life, reach the goals that we believe that we want to reach. Often, naturally, it involves slowly giving up pieces of yourself in a way that's so slow that you don't necessarily recognize it until you have that realization one day that you're not feeling comfortable. I want to start out by telling some of my own story, but I believe that it is something that is a common experience for many of you, and many of you will be able to relate to. So, for context, I am a children of immigrants. My parents moved to America right after the Cultural Revolution, where they lived a very hard life, where opportunities were scarce and competition was really high. So they basically lived their entire lives in survival mode. They had to be the best in order to not be miserable, not starve, not be at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So their entire lives were hard work, trying to outcompete their peers, and most of all, trying to build a better life for us here in America. So we, as their children, wouldn't have to sacrifice so much to just earn a basic living and earn our way into the world. But as a result of how they were brought up and how they didn't really have the luxury of experiencing emotional care or emotional affection during this process, that carried over to us. And by us, I mean me and my younger sister, Becky. So growing up, I felt that I was always very fortunate as a child. I never felt like anything was missing. I was physically provided for, I had everything I needed, and I had, for the most part, very supportive parents. It wasn't until adulthood, when I started reflecting back on my childhood, that I started realizing this wasn't exactly everyone's experience. My experience was missing certain elements that were subtle but have affected me later in life. And I don't blame my parents at all for this. They definitely did the best with what they had. But the reality was that I was taught from a very young age this model of having to earn respect, attention, affection, and love. Having to perform in order to deserve these things. So I think most children may have this memory of their parents just having casual conversations with them, asking how they are, being really happy to just see them exist, and really appreciative of the personality that develops and just being there for them, having happy family memories. I think I definitely had many of these, but I don't remember too much. The things that I do remember are that instead of just sitting and watching a movie together as a family, just relaxing in the living room and having a good time, we would watch the movie. And then after we watched it, there would always be a quiz at the end. So my parents would review what happened with me. And this is maybe at the age of 4 or 5 when I was just starting school and learning how to speak. My mom would ask me, what happened here? How many characters were here? What was this scene like? Just testing my memory and my comprehension of what happened. So it felt like everything in life, even the fun things in life, are a test. And they were only really showing appreciation and pride and love towards me based on my performance and based on how I scored. This continued into my school years, where really my dad wasn't around too much because he traveled a lot for work. But my mom didn't have too much time to pay attention to the two of us. She was basically raising us on her own. And the only time we would get mom's attention is when we got our report cards and got good grades, or we had some sort of piano recital, sports game, somewhere where we could demonstrate some sort of high performance, because to her, she was still following this equation of performance equals success, especially academic performance, work performance, and extracurriculars, that sort of thing. So even though I felt loved and I felt provided for, I got very early on this sense that I have to do certain things and do them well by external standards and please others in order to be worthy. And this carried with me basically up until now. I don't think that I will ever get over it. But I do think there is a phase in my life when I started to rebel against this constant pressure for external validation. And that was in my teenage years. I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but it kind of coincided with me having difficulty to make friends anyway. So during my high school and college years, I had a little bit of a rebellious streak where I just embraced the identity of being a loner and being on my own and being myself. I thought that it was very strong at this time, like many teenagers do, to reject social norms entirely. I don't need to be popular. I don't need to be accepted. But really, it was just a cope. And we all know it is. Like, there is the group of popular kids at school who fully embrace conformity in order to keep their social status because they have access to that status. And then there are people like me, the bottom feeders of the high school socially, where even if we tried, we wouldn't necessarily get to join that inner circle. So, in order to cope with that situation, it's very easy to say, well, other people are weak because they care about fitting in. They care about following trends. Like, I am independent from these trends. I have my own independent personality, thoughts, and feelings, and I don't care what anyone else thinks of me. I tried to believe that, and I wanted to believe that so badly. But in parallel to it, I suffered probably the worst mental health of my entire life just due to the loneliness and the isolation that resulted. And even now, as an adult, if I had a chance to speak to younger Michelle, teenage Michelle, I would tell her, hey, it's fine to seek social approval. Fitting in is important to some extent. Yes, you should not give up too much of yourself, but the pain of being yourself at the expense of not having any connection to other people around you is now obviously to me completely not worth it. And to be totally honest, guys, the story I was telling myself was that it didn't matter. I was being independent, I was being myself. But what did I know? I was just a teenager. I was entering my early 20s, and I didn't know who I was and what I wanted. I think in some ways, I was building myself still on social expectations, and I was building myself on trying to fall in line with those. It was just that I didn't follow the mainstream expectations, but I tried to find other things that I could aim for. I still felt like I needed some idea externally of what to aim for and what was good. And I was still absorbing messages from society, even if the messages weren't like be a cheerleader or be popular, but the messages were instead sink yourself into academics, put your head down and work really hard and try to get a good job. Like those were also social programming. So even though I tried to convince myself and believe that I was being authentic during this time and believe that I was being strong and independent, I wasn't really asking those questions internally as I was just looking for different sources of external reasoning. And when I entered the workforce, this is where I feel like it kind of hit home for me that I could get farther if I wasn't walking my own path. And I kind of want to explain that. So, I graduated college and then I immediately entered the tech industry. And I entered as a software engineer. And if you know anything about tech, especially how tech was, what was it, 10, 15 years ago, it's a very white, male dominated industry. And going in as my first job as an engineer, I quickly realized there is a lot of subconscious bias within the field because when you see 90% of people around you who look exactly like you, who act like you, who like the same video games, read the same websites and blogs, and live in that culture, and then you see that Asian girl in the desk next to you who just by appearance and mannerisms alone is completely different, you don't really know what to expect from that person. Often your expectations are going to be lower. So I felt like I was kind of playing the role of diversity hire, even though I feel like I did deserve the jobs that I got. I think that the people around me and my coworkers, they would take one look at me and think, she's a woman, she needs some help getting up to speed. We'll have to be a little more patient with her. So I knew that acting feminine, especially, and maybe even acting too Asian in some spaces would cast me off from the majority and lower people's expectations of what I was able to achieve. I felt that it took a lot longer for me to enter a job and then completely earn people's trust and respect to do things independently as it did my male peers. And this was regardless of our talent level. So, in my first two or three jobs, I think when I started, I was always underestimated, and it always took longer for me to earn that trust. So over time, I felt out of necessity that I had to change the way I came off. I started to adapt to the highly masculine environment that I was in. And I started recognizing certain aspects, certain attributes of myself that I could modify in order to almost tell people or show to people right away, hey, I'm not a weak girly girl. I am just like you. So I adapted these traits. Of course, I don't look like a man, but I started doing things like communicating more assertively. I started raising my hand and volunteering for things more. I started learning how to play office politics, going out to the sports bar to grab beers with the guys after work. I learned that that was more important than the quality of my work. So, learning how to play that social game, be one of the guys, talk about lewd subjects sometimes so I could fit in, and learn to assert myself so I didn't seem too shy or timid. I adapted my personality to my environment and my identity became strategic. How I came off and who I was became a strategic play to win the game of garnering respect in the workplace and being able to advance up the ranks. I was kind of lucky I learned this and I was able to do it because I did get a lot of opportunities. And I would say that by all traditional standards, my corporate career was a pretty big success. I worked in all sorts of environments. I felt like I learned how to create strong relationships with other people. But I ultimately did feel like I lost myself as a part of it because it's very hard to keep your own identity and your work identity as separate things. It's very hard to continue playing the part without assuming that identity when you are spending 8 to 10 hours a day in that environment and you are continuing to practice and rehearse the way you should act in that environment. So, from that experience, I learned the hard lesson that authenticity is a privilege. I remember very clearly in one of my jobs as an engineer, well, I was working for a very progressive office. So we actually had this conversation about bringing your whole self to work. And this was a trend in Silicon Valley at the time as they were trying to promote all these DEI initiatives, get more people, more diversity into their offices. We had this conversation as a group about how we can bring our full selves and be our full selves at work. And I very quickly rejected that notion. I remember I felt very, I don't know, I felt very called out in that instance because I knew I wasn't being myself at work. And I also drew on my past experiences where being myself did nothing but hurt me in the workplace. So I don't know. I think my belief in that is that no matter how much we try to deny that it isn't, authenticity in certain spaces is a privilege. If I was a white male who grew up in an upper class family on the East Coast, then absolutely I can be my whole authentic self at work, and that would do nothing to my detriment. It would only help me. But because I am a woman in a male dominated space, it completely benefited me to not act like myself. And I knew that. And I would rather not act like myself in order to succeed because it was one of my values at that time to be successful at work. It was literally my number one value. So, of course, I would do anything to make that happen. And farther along this journey, I also realized I am pretending, I am playing a part, but I'm doing it in order to make more money, have more power, do the things that my parents put me on this earth to do. And it felt like a deep responsibility of mine to have a successful career. As I got older, I started asking myself more of why? Well, why do I want this aside from how everyone around me was telling me that I should want this? And that was a harder question for me to answer. I started realizing, especially as I got into my late 20s, that there's this unspoken blueprint for life. And if you don't follow the blueprint, depending on what space you're in, you will be socially ostracized. People will judge you, talk about you behind your back. It is really uncomfortable if you don't fall in line. So, the easiest thing to do is just follow the structure of life that's been laid out for you. And it goes something like this. First, you get a good education, get your college degree, then land a good job with good pay, work hard at your job, earn enough money to be attractive on the dating pool, get your life together, get a stable income that's steady for a long period of time, get married before you're 30, have kids immediately after, buy a house, settle down, live happily ever after. That is the blueprint and the steps you're supposed to follow between the ages of approximately 20 and 35. And very few people in my community at the time, because I was in a very privileged corporate tech worker community, veered away from from that set of instructions and that timeline. Even now, all my friends from my previous career, almost all of them have settled into married life, family life, have been traveling and buying homes and doing everything to the T of what's expected. So it's obviously the most frictionless, easiest path to just follow along and be like everyone else in that respect. But for some reason, something about this, it didn't feel right for me. Deep down, I just had this gut feeling that this path and this life was not for me, especially the career part. Despite being really successful by any conventional standards in my tech career, I always felt weird. I felt like I wasn't at home, and I wasn't at home within myself. I did feel physically comfortable at work. I did develop social comfort with my coworkers, but in my own heart and in my own head, I felt like this was not the right place for me. And it wasn't until much later in life that I had the courage to actually take a chance and try something else on for size, something else that I thought would fit me better. And I was really scared to do this. It was very scary because I had spent 8 years basically putting everything on the line, pouring myself blood, sweat, and tears into my work to get to the level that I was. And my life would have been very easy. It would have been cruising downhill from there if I just continued. But in 2021, I decided to leave tech for good. And after I announced to all of my coworkers, supervisors, friends that I was making a career transition and I was not only leaving my current role, but I was leaving the tech industry as a whole. I thought people would maybe react poorly for some reason. I thought that they would maybe say, hey, you should think this through. It might not be the right path for you. You have so much talent, Michelle. Think through it again. Really consider if you want to stay. But instead, I got some of those. I definitely got some people who reached out to me and said words like that. But many more people came out of the woodwork, reached out to have a one on one conversation with me. And then people who I hardly knew poured their heart out and expressed that, hey, they also felt uncomfortable. And it was shocking who some of these people are. Let me tell you, some of the people who had always looked so happy and did their job so well and so effortlessly, the people who were at the top of their game, who I imagined to be corporate lifers for sure, reached out to me and we had conversations about how they were having lots of doubts. They weren't feeling like tech was right for them either, but they just felt this irresistible pull towards staying because they didn't know what else they would do. They didn't want to give up security, stability, what they knew and what they had trained themselves to do in order to take a gamble on something that was unknown. So many people, as I realized, are stuck in a condition that they don't know if it's right for them, but it was too hard to get to the root of what was wrong and what was missing because you have so much privilege. You have so much going for you. Everything you have is what you should want. It's what you should want. Why do you not want it and why are you not happy? So people would have these external voices, maybe what they perceive as social expectations, just shouting this at them. So they would feel like, wow, it's my own fault that I'm dissatisfied right now. It's my own fault that I can't be happy right now. I want to just acknowledge for a minute that, yes, all of this is a very privileged perspective to have. I know from both my parents and other immigrants that it is a privilege just to have a job that supports your life. So I'm already in a position where the fact that I had that, yes, I can completely understand the perspective that I should just be very thankful for having that. And I am very grateful for the opportunities I had in the past. And I'm very grateful for the privilege I had to not only experience that life, but leave that life for one that was better suited for me. And I just want to recognize that not everyone has that. So there are some words that have really guided me through this transition in my life. And I think that they would be really helpful to hear for anyone who's having doubts about their own position in life. When you are feeling lost, it's often a result of following the crowd. Following the crowd is the easiest and most comfortable way through life. But the cost of that comfort is losing yourself. And this concept comes in different degrees too. It's not like you can just refuse to follow the crowd at all costs. Of course, you want to fit in, you want to have social connection. That's a basic human need. And of course, again, not all of us have the privilege to even choose to go our own way. So we are sacrificing ourselves, but we're sacrificing ourselves to different degrees, right? So for some of us, it may be tolerable. We may choose complete conformity, but it may be completely tolerable and at least somewhat adherent to our own views of ourselves. But for others, it may be just complete denial of your own identity to go a certain way just to please others. And it also depends on who are the others you want to please. I think most of us have some choice in the groups we want to belong to, in that there are different options out there for who you want to fit in with, who you want to connect with, who you want to collaborate with, and those can look different depending on who. But to me, it stands to say that most of the time, if you feel lost, it's because you're following the crowd too much and you're not listening to yourself enough. Many of us hear the advice growing up to just be yourself or be true to yourself, listen to yourself. But I think that those words are just not nuanced enough. Because even though the idea of being ourselves and being completely true to ourselves, they sound great and they're very attractive. And if you hear them, most people would nod along and agree and say, yeah, be true to yourself, be authentic. But the truth is, authenticity has limits. We live in a world where there are certain contexts where we do have to take others into consideration. We have to take our environment and our communities into consideration of how we act. The analogy I often like to give is authenticity, 100% full authenticity, is like being a toddler. If you've ever seen a 3-year-old walk down the street, approach a woman, complete stranger, and first thing they say is, wow, why does your nose look so weird? That is something that would definitely not be socially acceptable for an adult. So we have learned to filter ourselves for good reason. We've learned to cooperate with others and cooperate with some social expectation for a good reason so that we can actually realistically interact with the world around us and find our way within the constraints of the world around us. So while full authenticity in its pure form might not be completely possible, we have to acknowledge who we are and get to know who we are so we know what types of trade-offs we can make. The mistake that a lot of people make is not necessarily a matter of not being themselves, but it's rather a matter of not knowing themselves and not knowing which parts of themselves are important to hold on to. So, living life as an adult and losing who you are, losing your sense of self, I believe is more of an issue with us getting out of touch with what we really want and who we really are than it is just us choosing not to act it out. And as I've gotten older, I've learned to make certain trade offs that preserve parts of myself that I want to preserve that also work with the conditions of my life that I was given. The first one that we just mentioned is that I chose a career in health coaching and I chose to transition into this career rather than staying in corporate tech because I had an introspection about my personal values and I made a very intentional decision that I prioritize having deep connection with other people a lot more than I prioritize financial gain. So I gave up financial stability and security in order to pursue this aspect of my purpose that I felt was very core to who I am as a human. And that was a trade off that I made willingly, and I haven't looked back. Another that comes up often when talking about health and talking about healthy lifestyles is I intentionally transitioned from a life that I lived in my 20s where I would frequently go out to eat, go out to drink at bars, and sleep in on the weekends. I traded that for a life where I don't really drink anymore. I rarely eat at restaurants, go to bed early on Fridays, wake up on Saturdays, and get a good workout in at the gym. And that was a decision between social occasions, experiencing culture, and my self esteem. And I just recognized for myself that the way I felt in my body and the way that I treated my body was just so much more important to my self belief and my self identity than it was to participate in this culture of trying out new foods and drinking alcohol. So that was also a very personal decision for me, and that I know a lot of people tend to make later in life. The hardest one for me personally is the decision to hold off on having kids. And this is also very controversial, both within wider society, but especially within Asian culture. Because in my culture and with my family, there's an expectation that once you get married, you pretty much immediately start trying for kids. Marriage is the starting line of having babies. But for me, even though I am getting older and it's been a while since I initially got married, I still have no kids. And it's not because I don't want them. Children are a huge value of mine. I've always wanted to assume a role of a mom. That's very important to me. But it's rather because I recognized in myself that there's some emotional healing left to do. And how I referenced my upbringing at the beginning of this conversation, I want to get to a point where I am less likely to pass on generational trauma from my grandparents and my parents to my children. So I'm choosing to work on myself, get more solid there, and delay having kids. So, in closing, I don't really have any strong words of advice because this process is very individual. It's really to each their own. But what I would encourage all of you to think about is learn your values. Look inside, see who you really are, and see what part of that you do want to bring into that world. What part of your true self is important for you to maintain authenticity in? And that's a very hard question because often, as we mentioned, authenticity comes at a cost. Fitting in is easy, following the crowd is comfortable. But another few words I like to remember are everything you need is already within you. If you're struggling with who you are, if you're looking for answers externally, if you have an issue that you keep ruminating about and you just can't find yourself making any progress, remember those words. Everything you need is already within you. If you're able to determine your values, determine your priorities, determine what matters to you as a human being, everything else will become obvious. It's not an easy journey. It takes a while. And authenticity is a gray area. You can be authentic in some parts of your lives and you can choose to hide other parts, and that is a totally normal decision and it's a totally necessary decision in some regard. But if you are struggling with figuring out who you are and how you want to live, then I hope this gives you at least some ideas of where to start.